before we begin, a quick and important note. Elvis Presley and Dean Martin were real people, and their friendship in the world of American entertainment was real. But everything you are about to hear, the hospital room, the conversation, the final request, is a fictional tribute imagined for this video. There is no historical record confirming the specific scene ever took place. Think of it as a what if, a piece of storytelling built to honor the kind of bond these two men were known to share, not a documented account of real events. With that understood, let's begin. The hallway is quiet. Too quiet for a building that usually hums with footsteps, gurneys rolling over polished floors, and the low murmur of machines keeping people tethered to life. A nurse stands frozen near a half-open doorway, a tissue pressed against her mouth, her eyes glassy in a way that has nothing to do with exhaustion. Behind her, a doctor who has delivered more bad news than he can count finds, to his own quiet surprise that his hands are trembling. Further down the corridor, a cleaning cart sits abandoned, forgotten, because the man pushing it stopped to watch something he already senses he will never forget. Inside that room, two of the most recognizable men on the planet are, for a moment, not famous at all. They are simply two old friends, alone with each other in the peculiar honesty that illness brings. And one of them is about to ask the other for something so small in its wording, and so enormous in its meaning, that by the time the door finally clicks shut, there will not be a single dry eye left in that building. This is not a story about stardom. It is a story about what remains when the stardom is stripped away, and about who still walks through the door when the lights go dark and nobody is watching. Stay with us, because although the scene you are about to witness is imagined, the friendship behind it and the truth at the center of it are worth sitting with all the way to the end. Think, for a moment, about how rarely the world ever gets to see its icons in a moment like this. We see the stage version endlessly, the album covers, the concert footage, the magazine spreads, the interviews where every answer has been rehearsed a dozen times before the cameras ever rolled. We build entire mythologies around people we have never actually met, filling in the blanks of their private lives with our own assumptions, our own projections, our own desperate need to believe that the people we admire are exactly as larger than life behind closed doors as they appear to be under stage lights. But behind every closed hospital door, behind every drawn curtain, behind every quiet room the cameras are never invited into, there is simply a person, tired, afraid, hopeful, human. And it is only in rooms like that, imagined or otherwise, that we ever get close to understanding who somebody actually was, rather than who the world decided they should be. To understand why this imagined moment carries so much emotional weight, you first have to understand who these two men were, both to the world and to each other. Elvis Presley did not simply sing. He detonated something inside American culture that had never fully existed before him. In the middle of the 1950s, a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, with a voice that seemed to rise from somewhere between a Sunday gospel choir and a smoky blues bar, stepped in front of a television camera, moved in a way nobody expected, and the world tilted slightly on its axis. Parents clutched their pearls. Teenagers screamed until their voices gave out. A new kind of fame, raw and uncontrollable, was born in that instant, and would follow him faithfully and mercilessly for the rest of his life. Dean Martin came from an entirely different universe, though one that brushed against Elvis's world more often than most people realize. Martin was smooth where Elvis was wild, ironic where Elvis was sincere, effortless where Elvis was explosive. He built an entire career on charm alone. The half-lidded eyes, the drink perpetually in hand, the joke always cocked and ready to fire. As part of the legendary circle of entertainers who ruled Las Vegas in that era, he owned a stage the way a man owns the living room of his own house. Completely and without a flicker of doubt. Two very different kinds of stardom. Two very different kind of men. And yet, in an industry famous for shallow friendships, quiet rivalries, and short memories, these two found something rarer than any Billboard chart position or box office record. They found mutual respect that did not need an audience to exist. Their paths crossed across the decades, in the neon deserts of Las Vegas, where showbiz royalty from every generation eventually found themselves standing under the same lights, and in the private corners of Hollywood, where actors and singers orbited the same restaurants, the same parties, the same handful of powerful, smoke-filled rooms. It is well known that a young Elvis grew up listening to Dean Martin's voice pouring out of the family radio long before the world called him a king of anything, and that in his own quiet way, Elvis carried a genuine admiration for the man whose ease on stage he privately longed to have. Those who moved in Martin's orbit often noted that beneath his famously unbothered exterior, he held a real and understated fondness for the younger man who had once idolized him from a distance and eventually outpaced him in raw, worldwide fame. Fame like theirs is often described by those who lived inside it as a strange kind of isolation. When millions of strangers know your face better than they know their own neighbors, it becomes oddly difficult for anyone to know the actual person living behind that face. But the entertainment world of that particular era operated on an unspoken code. A small circle of people who survived the exact same impossible pressures. The crowds, the expectations, the loneliness hidden neatly behind spotlights. Within that circle, something like genuine friendship could take root and quietly survive, even when everything around it was designed to be temporary. This is the world our story lives in. Not a courtroom where historians certify every private conversation that ever happened between two celebrities, but a believable, deeply human space where two men who understood each other's specific, unglamorous kind of exhaustion might sit together, far from cameras, and simply talk the way old friends talk when nobody else is listening. Consider, for a moment, just how different the machinery of their two careers actually was. Dean Martin came up through nightclubs and vaudeville stages, learning his trade in smoky rooms where a performer either won the crowd over in the first 2 minutes or spent the rest of the night fighting an uphill battle. He learned patience there. He learned that charm, real charm, was not about trying too hard, but about looking like you were barely trying at all. By the time he partnered with a young comedian and the two of them became one of the most successful double acts in entertainment history, Dean had already built the armor he would wear for the rest of his public life. The raised eyebrow, the half smile, the sense that nothing could ever fully rattle him. Elvis, by contrast, arrived like a storm. There was no slow apprenticeship, no decade of small clubs to toughen him gradually. One moment, he was an unknown young man driving a truck in Memphis, and the next, he was standing in front of television cameras watched by more people than had ever tuned into a single broadcast in American history. There was no time to build armor. He simply had to survive being famous while still figuring out, in real time, who he even was. It is precisely because their paths to stardom were so different that their eventual friendship carries a particular weight it does in our story. Dean had already lived through the disorienting climb Elvis was still in the middle of. He understood, better than almost anyone else in that industry, what it costs a person to be adored by millions of strangers while slowly losing the ordinary, boring privacy that most people never even think to be grateful for. There are, in fact, real and well-documented accounts of the two men appearing at the same events throughout the 1960s and 1970s, of Elvis attending certain Las Vegas performances where Martin was headlining, and of the warm, easy rapport photographers occasionally caught between them backstage. These brief, genuine glimpses are the seeds for which our fictional story grows. We do not know what they discussed in those brief backstage exchanges. Nobody wrote it down in enough detail for history to preserve. But the warmth itself, the ease between them, was real enough to be remembered by the people who witnessed it. So the question our story asks is this: what happens when one of those two men is running out of time and the other one finds out? By the middle of the 1970s, the man that millions once watched breathlessly from arena seats was quietly carrying a weight that almost none of them ever saw. The performances did not stop. The lights did not dim. The crowds did not shrink. But behind the sequins, behind the perfectly choreographed finales, exhaustion had settled into his bones. The specific kind of exhaustion that comes only from a decade of relentless touring, of never truly being allowed to rest, of a life lived entirely and permanently in front of other people's eyes. Picture it clearly. A dressing room moments after another sold-out show. The roar of thousands of voices still ringing faintly somewhere behind the ears, refusing to fully fade. And yet, in the stillness after the final curtain falls, there's a quiet that feels less like peace and more like depletion, the particular hollowness of a body that has given everything it has to give, night after night, with no room left to recover. This is the emotional truth our fictional story chooses to lean into, not a specific verified diagnosis, not a documented medical event, but a very real and well-understood reality That superstardom of that magnitude, in that era, often came at a devastating personal cost. The fans saw invincibility on stage. The people standing closest to these stars, the ones who saw it without the lights and the makeup, often saw something far more fragile. In our imagined version of events, it is during a period like this, a stretch of physical depletion and quiet, uncomfortable reflection, that Elvis finds himself for a time inside a hospital room, not for headlines, not for spectacle, simply because a body, worn down by years of relentless demand, has finally forced itself to stop. Picture the room itself in this imagined telling. It is not the grand, gilded suite the tabloids might expect for a man of his stature. It is simple, sterile, and quiet in a way his life almost never allows. A window looks out over an ordinary parking lot instead of stage. A tray of untouched food sits cooling on a rolling table. A guitar, brought by someone on his staff in the hope that it might lift his spirits, leans untouched against the wall, its case unopened. Because for the first time and longer than anyone around him can remember, Elvis does not reach for it. The staff who move quietly in and out of that room in our story are used to famous patients. Doctors in that particular hospital have treated senators, athletes, and film stars without blinking. But there is something different about the stillness surrounding this particular patient. Something that makes even the most composed nurse pause a half-second longer than usual before entering. Perhaps it is simply the strange dissonance of seeing a man so accustomed to deafening applause lie in a room where the loudest sound is the soft beep of a heart monitor. Word travels fast in any hospital, but faster still when the patient is someone whose face has been on every magazine cover for 2 straight decades. Within hours, most of the staff on that wing know exactly who is behind that door, even if officially nobody says his name out loud in the hallways. And within a day, word has traveled further still, out past the hospital doors, through a phone call placed quietly by someone close to Elvis to someone close to Dean, carrying a simple message. He isn't doing well, and he keeps asking about you. And when word reaches an old friend that Elvis is not doing well, that friend does not send flowers to an assistant. He does not send a carefully worded telegram through a publicist, the kind of gesture that looks compassionate in a headline, but costs the sender nothing in either time or discomfort. He puts on his jacket, cancels the rest of his afternoon without a second thought, and shows up himself. Dean Martin comes in person. The corridor outside the private hospital room is unusually still that afternoon. Security stands near the door, not because anyone anticipates trouble, but because word has already begun rippling quietly through the staff. He's here, the other one, the one from the old Vegas nights, the one whose voice used to fill every lounge from the sands to the Sahara. Dean Martin walks in without an entourage trailing behind him. No sunglasses perched on his nose this time. No cigarette balanced between 2 fingers. Just a tailored jacket. Tired eyes that have clearly aged more since the last photograph anyone took of him. And the unmistakable, easy gait of a man who has walked into 1,000 rooms as though he owned every one of them. Except this time, he walks in like he is almost afraid of what he might find on the other side of the door. He pauses in the doorway for just a moment. Elvis is sitting upright in the hospital bed, a robe pulled over his hospital gown, looking noticeably thinner than a version of him plastered across 1,000 teenage bedroom walls. But when he sees Dean standing there, something shifts across his face. The exhaustion does not vanish, but it softens, replaced by something closer to relief. The specific relief of a man who has been waiting, quietly and without saying so, for exactly this visitor. "Well, look who finally got dressed up for me," Elvis says, his voice quieter than any fan watching a concert film would recognize, but with that familiar warmth still unmistakably present underneath it. Dean lets out a short laugh, one that catches slightly in his throat halfway through. "You always did like an audience." He answers. He pulls a chair close to the bed, rather than keeping a polite distance the way most visitors instinctively do around illness. Dean does not keep his distance. He sits near enough that their conversation never needs to rise above a low, private murmur. For a while, they do not speak of anything heavy at all. They talk about Las Vegas, about the years when the two of them, alongside a handful of other larger-than-life personalities, seemed to own that entire glittering stretch of desert night. They talk about a show from years earlier, when a much younger Elvis, still dazzled by his own childhood idol, had nervously introduced himself backstage to Dean, barely able to believe that the voice that once poured out his family's radio was now standing directly in front of him, close enough to shake hands with. Dean remembers it a little differently. Kinder in the retelling. "You weren't nervous," he says, shaking his head slowly. "You walked up like you already knew you were going to be bigger than every single one of us in that building." Elvis lets out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh, his eyes drifting somewhere past the hospital walls, back into a memory only he can fully see. "I was terrified," he admits. "I just knew how to hide it well. You actually taught me that, come to think of it, how to smile so big that nobody could see anything underneath." There is one night in particular, in our imagined version of their shared history, that Elvis brings up now, smiling faintly at the memory even through his exhaustion. He asks Dean if he remembers a particular evening years earlier, after a show, when the two of them ended up sitting alone at a piano long after the audience had gone home, and the cleaning crews had begun sweeping up confetti and spilled drinks around them. Dean's face softens immediately at the memory. "Of course I remember," he says. "You wouldn't stop asking me to play that one song your mother used to hum around the house. Made me play about 6 times before you were satisfied." Elvis laughs quietly, the sound catching slightly in his chest. "You played it perfect every single time. I just wanted to hear it a few extra minutes longer. Some nights, that song was the only thing that made this whole business feel like it was still worth all the trouble." Dean is quiet for a moment, remembering. "You never told me that back then." "Didn't need to," Elvis answers. "You already knew. That's the thing about you, Dean. You always seem to know exactly which parts didn't need explaining." Dean nods slowly, some old, private emotion passing briefly across his features before his usual composure returns. That's what happens when two people spend enough nights in empty rooms after the crowd's already gone home, he says. You stop needing the words so much. The words hang in the air a little longer than either of them intends. This is the exact moment in our fictional retelling where two survivors of the same brutal industry finally let their guards down completely because they both understand, without needing to explain it further, exactly what the other one has spent an entire lifetime hiding behind. Nurses passing by the room later would describe something they were not fully prepared for. Not two celebrities performing charmingly for one another, the way famous people so often do even in private, but two visibly tired men speaking plainly, almost like brothers who have simply run out of reasons to keep up appearances with each other. "You ever get tired of it?" Elvis asks at one point. Not fame specifically, something larger than fame. The performing, the never once being fully off, even in the quiet hours. Dean considers a question for a long moment, absent-mindedly turning the ring on his finger, and for a brief flicker something older and heavier passes behind his eyes, something that has nothing to do with the room they are currently sitting in this imagined telling. Dean's own life has not been without its private griefs either, losses of his own that he rarely speaks of publicly. Weight he learned long ago to carry quietly behind an easy smile rather than display for an audience that only ever wanted a charming version of him. It is perhaps precisely because he has learned to carry his own burden so quietly that he recognizes, almost instantly, the exact shape of the burden Elvis is now carrying too. Every single day, he finally says, "But you learn pretty quick. The crowd out there doesn't want a tired version of you. So you save that particular version for the very few people who already know you're tired anyway, and don't need you pretend otherwise." Elvis studies him carefully. "Is that what this is?" he asks. "You showing me the tired version?" Dean's usually effortless. Practiced smile falters slightly, just enough to reveal something raw and real underneath it. "Yeah, kid," he answers quietly. "This is exactly that." The room falls into silence again, though it is not an uncomfortable one. It is a particular kind of silence shared only by two people who have already said everything words are capable of saying, and are now simply content to sit together in whatever remains. After a while, Dean glances toward a small framed photograph sitting on the bedside table, half turned toward the window, catching the afternoon light. It's his daughter, of course, a little girl with dark hair and a serious, watchful expression, the kind of photograph a father keeps close not because he needs reminding of what she looks like, but because looking at it steadies something in his chest. "She's still asking you to come home early." Dean asks, nodding toward the photograph. Elvis's whole face changes at the question, the exhaustion momentarily replaced by something softer. Every single night, I'm on the road, he says. Calls the house asking if Daddy's plane landed yet. Doesn't matter what time it is. 6 years old, and she already knows how to make a grown man feel guilty over the phone. Dean laughs quietly. That's not guilt, kid. That's love. Guilt doesn't usually come with that big a smile attached to it. Elvis looks down at his hands for a moment, turning a ring absent-mindedly, the way Dean had turned his own earlier. You ever think about it? He asks what they're going to remember, not the fans. Her, what she's actually going to remember about who her daddy was, once she's old enough to really understand any of this. Dean considers the question with the same seriousness he might give to reading a difficult contract. All the time, he admits, my kids didn't grow up with a normal father either. They grew up with a guy who was on a stage 300 nights a year, and on a film set the rest of the time. I used to worry they'd only remember the version of me that showed up in magazines. And did they? Elvis asked quietly. Only remember that version? Dean shakes his head slowly. No, because somewhere along the way, somebody who actually knew me made sure they heard the other stuff too. The version that wasn't for the cameras. That's the only reason they know the difference at all. Elvis is quiet for a long moment, absorbing that answer more deeply than his expression initially lets on. It is in the wake of this exchange, in our fictional telling, that the shape of what he is about to ask finally begins to take form in his mind, no longer as an abstract worry, but as something specific enough to put into words. Outside, a nurse pauses near the door with chart pressed against her chest, hesitant to interrupt whatever is happening inside. Something about the atmosphere in that room stops her from knocking right away. She would later describe the feeling as stumbling into somewhere she was never meant to witness, which, for two men who had spent their entire adult lives being watched by strangers, was perhaps the rarest gift either of them could offer the other, a single moment that belonged only to them. But the conversation is about to shift, because Elvis did not ask his old friend to travel all this way simply to reminisce about old Vegas nights. Elvis grows quiet, and Dean, a man who has spent decades reading rooms, audiences, and the moods of every kind of person imaginable, notices immediately that something in his old friend's posture has changed. Dean, Elvis says slowly, I need to ask you something. And I need you to say yes before I even finish saying it. Because if you think about it too long, you're going to try and talk me out of it. Dean leans forward slightly in his chair. You know me better than that, he says. Ask. Elvis takes a slow breath. When he finally speaks again, his voice has lost every trace of performance in it. This is not the voice of the king of rock and roll. This is the voice of a boy from Tupelo who never quite stopped being somebody's son and somebody's friend. When all of this is over, whenever that finally happens, I don't want the story people tell to be only about the shows or the records or any of that. I've had my whole entire life to be Elvis Presley for the rest of the world. I need one person, just one, to make sure somebody remembers the part of me that was never a performance. He pauses, gathering himself. I want you to make sure somebody tells the truth about it eventually, not the legend, not the myth people are already building around me while I'm still standing right here. Just the guy who used to sit terrified backstage before every single show for 20 straight years. The guy who misses Mama every single day of his life since she passed. The guy who loved his little girl more than any stage he ever stood on, more than any crowd that ever screamed his name. I want somebody who actually knew that guy to say so out loud someday when I'm no longer around to say it myself. Dean is quiet for a long, heavy moment. When he finally answers, his voice carries an unsteadiness that fans his famously smooth, unbothered charm would never have recognized in 1,000 shows. That's it, he asks softly. That's your big favor? That's it, Elvis answers. That's everything. Dean reaches out and takes his old friend's hand. Not a showbiz handshake, not a polished gesture meant for cameras that aren't even there, but the plain, unguarded grip of one exhausted man holding on to another. I'll tell them, he says, every single word of it. I give you my word. It is in this exact, quiet moment, through the half-open door, that the people gathered outside finally understand what they are witnessing. A young nurse, still clutching her clipboard, feels her eyes sting before she even fully understands why. She is not crying because two celebrities happen to be sharing a room. She is crying because she has just watched something achingly human. A promise made not for cameras, not for headlines, but for the quiet, unglamorous truth of who somebody really was underneath all the noise. Word begins to move through the hallway the way it always does in hospitals. Quietly, quickly, without anyone formally announcing anything at all. A doctor pauses on his way to another patient. Two nurses exchange a glance. Neither of them can fully translate into words. An elderly patient being wheeled past in a wheelchair catches a brief glimpse through the open doorway and simply murmurs, "God bless them both," to no one in particular, before being wheeled onward down the hall. Nobody standing in that hallway needs the full context of the conversation happening behind that door. They do not need to know the exact words that were exchanged between the two men inside. What they can see plainly, written across the faces of both men, as Dean finally rises from his chair to leave, is more than enough. Two people who have spent their entire adult lives being watched by millions of strangers have just shared something that was never meant to be a show at all. One of the nurses, an older woman who has worked that floor for nearly 2 decades and long ago stopped being impressed by famous faces passing through her ward, will later tell a colleague that she has seen plenty of visitors cry in that hallway before. Grieving spouses, frightened children, parents receiving news no parent should ever have to receive. But she has rarely seen anyone cry the way the young orderly by the supply closet is crying now, quietly, almost apologetically, wiping at his face with the back of his sleeve as though embarrassed by an emotion he cannot quite explain to himself. It isn't sadness exactly, he tells her later. Try to find the right words for something that resists easy description. It's more like we all just got let in on a secret. Something real. In a building where everything usually feels like a performance for somebody's sake. Doctor performing calm. Patients performing bravery. And in there, for just a few minutes, nobody was performing anything at all. The old doctor, the same one whose hands had trembled slightly earlier that afternoon, finds himself thinking of his own oldest friend, a man he has not called in longer than he would like to admit. Someone from medical school decades earlier with whom he once shared every worry and every small triumph before life scattered them to opposite coasts. He makes a private, silent decision standing right there in that corridor, one he will act on before the week is out, to finally pick up the phone. It is a small, almost invisible ripple, the kind no camera ever captures and no headline ever reports. Yet it is arguably the truest kind of impact any act of friendship can have. Not applause, but imitation. Not fame, but the quiet decision of a stranger to go be a better friend to someone in his own life. As Dean straightens his jacket and turns toward the door, Elvis calls after him one last time, his voice suddenly lighter, some of his old, familiar mischief creeping back into it. "Hey, Dean." Dean turns back. "Yeah, try not to make my eulogy funnier than my actual songs. I've got a reputation to protect. Even from you." Dean laughs, a Rayall laugh this time. One that breaks the heaviness lingering in the room, just enough to let a little air back in. "No promises, kid," he answers. And with that, he steps out into the hallway. Past nurses who suddenly find urgent reasons to stare down at their clipboards. Past the doctor who clears his throat a little too firmly. Past the elderly patient who simply nods at him quietly as he walks by. Nobody says a single word to him. Nobody needs to. Dean does not go far once he leaves the room. In our imagined telling, he walks slowly down the corridor, past the same nurses and the same doctor, out through the sliding doors into a parking lot bathed in the flat, in different light of late afternoon. He does not immediately get into the car waiting for him. Instead, he stands for a moment beside it, one hand resting on the warm metal of the door, looking back up at the building as though he could somehow still see through its walls into the room he just left. A driver, sensing that his employer is not ready to move yet, says nothing and simply waits. Somewhere behind Dean, the ordinary sound of hospital life continue uninterrupted. An ambulance pulling in under the covered entrance, a family walking out with balloons for a newborn, a maintenance worker wheeling a car of supplies toward a side door. Life, indifferent and enormous, keeps moving forward exactly as it always does, entirely unaware of the promise that has just been made a few floors above. Dean finally gets into the car. He does not turn on the radio, though normally he might, out of old habit, out of performer's instinct to fill silence with something. Tonight, He lets the silence stay exactly as it is, turning the words of the conversation over in his mind the way a man turns over a coin he cannot quite decide whether to spend or keep. In the days, months, and years that follow, in our fictional telling of the story, Dean Martin is imagined to have kept that promise in his own quiet, understated way. Not through grand public statements chasing headlines, not through carefully staged interviews designed to generate sympathy, but through small, private moments. A comment shared with an old friend here, a quiet word passed along to family there, always gently, steering the conversation away from the myth and back toward the man underneath it. Perhaps, in his imagined version of events, there is an evening years later, long after the world has already spent countless headlines and countless documentaries trying to explain who Elvis Presley truly was, when a young reporter, hoping for a colorful anecdote about the king of rock and roll, asks Dean the same tired question he'd been asked 100 times before. What was he really like? And perhaps, instead of offering the polished, familiar answer expected of him, the funny road story or the well-worn compliment about talent, Dean pauses for a long moment, the way people do when a question has accidentally touched something they were not prepared to feel that day. He was scared of the same things the rest of us are scared of. Dean might say he just had to be scared of them in front of more people than most of us will ever have to stand in front of in our whole lives. That's the part nobody ever wants to put in the magazine. So I figure somebody ought to say it plainly at least once. The reporter, expecting a joke and receiving something far more honest instead, does not quite know what to do with the answer. But somewhere in the quiet space between the question and whatever gets printed afterward, a small piece of the truth survives. Not the whole picture. Never the whole picture. But enough. Enough that somewhere, someone reading it recognizes not the legend, but the man, because that in the end is a quiet tragedy that so often follows extraordinary fame. The wider the spotlight grows, the harder it becomes for anyone standing outside it to see the actual person living inside. Elvis Presley became such an enormous cultural symbol, so thoroughly mythologized, that the real human being at the center of it all, the son who adored his mother, the father who doted endlessly on his daughter, the friend who once stood nervously backstage waiting to shake his idol's hand, risked being slowly erased by the sheer size of his own legend. What this story imagines, and is not a historical fact meant to be filed away as documented truth, but an emotional reality that many people who have loved a public figure have felt deep in their chest at some point. The quiet fear that when we are finally gone, the world will remember only the performance and quietly forget the person who gave it everything. And what Dean Martin represents in this imagined telling is something all of us, in our own much smaller and quieter lives, secretly hope for. Not fame, not fortune, just one person, one single person, who truly knew us beneath every mask we ever wore, and who will say so honestly, without embellishment, long after we are no longer able to say it ourselves. Friendship, real friendship, rarely announces itself with fireworks or headlines. It shows up quietly, in hospital rooms that nobody else is allowed into, in favors asked without hesitation and granted without a single condition attached, in promises that are kept faithfully long after the person who first asked for them is gone. Elvis Presley and Dean Martin lived remarkably different lives, wore entirely different kinds of fame, and stood on very different kinds of stages throughout their careers. But in this imagined story, built from something achingly real about the true cost of stardom and the rarity of loyalty that asked for nothing in return, they remind us of something simple, something almost embarrassingly plain compared to everything else about their extraordinary lives. The greatest legacy anyone ever leaves behind is not the applause they once received. It is a handful of people who knew them long before that applause ever started, and who stayed close enough and honest enough to remember the truth about them long after it finally stopped. There's something almost unbearably relatable buried inside a story about two of the most famous men of the 20th century, and perhaps that is exactly why stories like this one continue to resonate with audiences so many decades later, even in imagined form. Very few of us will ever know what it feels like to walk onto a stage in front of 80,000 screaming strangers, or to have our faces recognized in every corner of the globe. But nearly all of us know what it feels like to wonder, quietly, late at night, whether people around us actually see the real version of who we are, or only the version we present to get through the day. Nearly all of us have, At some point, worried about being reduced to a single flattened image in the minds of people who never truly knew us. The co-worker who only knows us as reliable and cheerful, never guessing at the exhaustion underneath. The distant relative who only hears about our career updates, never the quiet doubts that keep us up at night. The old classmate who remembers only a version of us frozen in time. Never the person we quietly became long after they stopped paying attention. The acquaintance who assumes, because we always seem fine, that we always are. Fame simply magnifies a very ordinary human fear until it becomes impossible to ignore. Elvis Presley's imagined fear in this story, that the myth might quietly swallow the man, is not really a rock star's fear at all. It is everyone's fear, dressed up in sequins and stage lights, but recognizable underneath all the same. And Dean Martin's response, in his imagined telling, offers something just as universal as the fear it answers. He does not promise to fix anything. He does not offer some grand solution or a plan to reshape the world's perception. He simply promises to remember and to say so honestly when the moment eventually calls for it. It is such a small thing to ask for and such a small thing to promise. And yet it may be the single most valuable gift one human being can offer another. The guarantee that they will not be forgotten as only an idea, only a headline, only a highlight reel, but as a whole and complicated and tender person, exactly as they actually were. Perhaps that is a real reason a story like this one, even acknowledged openly as fiction, still manages to move so many people to tears. It is not really about Elvis Presley or Dean Martin at all, not fundamentally. It is about the quiet hope, tucked away in nearly every one of us, that somewhere, someone is paying close enough attention to remember who we truly are long after we can no longer remind them ourselves. One more time, before we close, a reminder worth repeating. The scene you just watched was a fictional tribute, not a documented historical event. Elvis Presley and Dean Martin's real friendship inspired every part of the story, but the specific hospital visit, the dialogue, and the final request were imagined entirely for the purposes of this video. We hope it still moved you anyway, because even inside fiction, the truth about friendship, memory, and legacy can be very real indeed. Icons like Elvis Presley and Dean Martin will always belong in part to the public. Their music, their films, their performances are woven so deeply into the fabric of an entire century that they no longer belong only to the men who created them. But somewhere underneath all of that, in the quiet corners of cameras were never invited into, they were still just two men, doing their best to hold on to something true, while the whole world watched everything except the parts that actually mattered most. That, perhaps, is the real gift a story like this one can offer, imagined or not. Reminder to look a little closer at the people around us, and to make sure that somewhere, someone truly knows who we are. If this story moved you even a little, take a moment to hit like, subscribe for more emotional tributes to the icons who shaped generations of music and film, and share with someone in your own life who still believes that real friendship outlasts fame, money, and every stage that fame ever built. And before you go, we would genuinely love to hear from you in the comment below. Who is the one person in your own life who truly knows the version of you that exists underneath everything the rest of the world sees? Have you ever actually told them so?